In a secret laboratory buried beneath the mountains of Switzerland, researchers just achieved something that should be impossible. They connected a human brain directly to a quantum computer, allowing thoughts to control digital systems at the speed of light. But when they tried to upload the consciousness itself, something went terribly wrong. The volunteer's body remained alive, breathing, heart beating. But behind their eyes, there was nothing. No recognition, no awareness, no spark of life, just an empty shell staring into the void. Scientists around the world are racing toward what they call the singularity, the moment when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence and changes everything forever. They promise us digital immortality, minds uploaded to the cloud, consciousness freed from the prison of flesh and bone. But what if consciousness isn't just information that can be copied and pasted? What if it's something far stranger, something that defies every law of physics and mathematics we understand? Tonight, we dive deep into the most profound mystery facing humanity's technological future. We'll explore why consciousness might be the unquantifiable barrier that prevents us from ever achieving true digital immortality. We'll visit research facilities where scientists are desperately trying to decode the neural correlates of awareness, examine philosophical paradoxes that have stumped the greatest minds for centuries, and investigate whether the very nature of conscious experience makes the singularity impossible. Before we venture into this rabbit hole of mystery and impossibility, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, because this journey will challenge everything you think you know about minds, machines, and what it means to be human. We're about to discover why consciousness might be the one thing that forever separates us from our digital dreams. Prepare yourselves. We begin. Picture this. You're lying on an operating table surrounded by the most advanced technology humanity has ever created. Quantum processors hum with computational power that dwarfs every computer on Earth combined. Neural mapping devices scan your brain with precision that can identify individual synapses firing. The procedure is simple in concept. Every neural pathway, every memory, every pattern of thought will be scanned, digitized, and uploaded to a quantum substrate that can simulate your brain perfectly. The scientists promise you digital immortality. Your consciousness transferred to a realm where death is impossible, where you can live forever in virtual worlds limited only by imagination. No more aging, no more disease, no more physical limitations, just pure thought existing in digital paradise. But here's the question that keeps philosophers awake at night and makes neuroscientists question their life's work. When they flip that switch and your brain patterns start flowing into the computer, what exactly are they copying? Are they transferring your consciousness, or are they simply creating a perfect replica that thinks it's you while the real you dies on the table? This isn't just philosophical speculation anymore. Companies are spending billions of dollars trying to solve this puzzle. Neuralink is developing brain-computer interfaces that could one day allow thoughts to control digital systems. Google's DeepMind is mapping neural networks with unprecedented detail. Research institutions across the globe are racing to decode the mystery of consciousness itself. Yet despite all this technological progress, we're no closer to understanding what consciousness actually is. We can measure brain activity, we can map neural pathways, we can even stimulate specific regions to trigger memories or emotions. But the actual experience of being conscious, the subjective feeling of awareness itself, remains completely beyond our scientific grasp. Think about the redness of red, not the wavelength of light that your brain interprets as red, but the actual subjective experience of seeing that color, the way it feels in your mind when you look at a rose or a fire truck. Scientists can measure the neural activity that occurs when you see red. They can identify which brain regions activate. They can even predict when you're about to see red before you're consciously aware of it, but they cannot explain why there's any subjective experience at all. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Not just how the brain processes information, but why there's something it feels like to be you. Why is there an inner experience accompanying all this neural computation? Why aren't we just sophisticated biological robots carrying out complex behaviors without any inner life whatsoever? The implications for digital consciousness are staggering. If consciousness is just information processing, then uploading your mind should be straightforward. Your brain is essentially a biological computer, and computers can be copied. But if consciousness involves something beyond mere information processing, something that emerges from the specific physical properties of biological neural networks, then digital immortality might be nothing more than an elaborate fantasy. Here's where it gets even stranger. Recent experiments in neuroscience have revealed something that challenges our most basic assumptions about the relationship between brain activity and conscious experience. Researchers at major universities have discovered that consciousness appears to have a kind of temporal thickness, existing not just in single moments, but across time intervals that span hundreds of milliseconds. When you experience the present moment, your brain is actually integrating information from multiple time points, creating a unified conscious experience from neural events that are separated by significant delays. This temporal binding of consciousness suggests that awareness isn't just about information processing in the present, but about the brain's ability to create coherent experiences across time. But here's the problem. Digital computers, no matter how sophisticated, process information sequentially, one calculation after another. Even quantum computers, for all their parallel processing power, operate according to mathematical principles that are fundamentally different from the temporal dynamics of biological consciousness. The human brain operates on principles that seem to violate basic assumptions about computation. Neurons fire at roughly 40 Hz, incredibly slow compared to modern processors that operate at gigahertz speeds. Yet somehow this slow biological hardware creates the rich unified experience of consciousness that includes emotions, sensations, memories, and self-awareness all simultaneously present in each moment of experience. Scientists have tried to replicate these conditions in artificial systems. They've built neural networks with millions of artificial neurons. They've created computers that can recognize faces better than humans, play chess better than grandmasters, and generate art that's indistinguishable from human creativity. But none of these systems report any subjective experience. They process information brilliantly, but there's nobody home behind the calculations. This absence of reported inner experience in artificial systems points to something profound about consciousness that we're missing. Either these systems are conscious but lack the ability to communicate their inner experience, or consciousness requires something that artificial systems fundamentally lack. Some researchers propose that consciousness emerges from quantum mechanical processes in the brain. They point to structures called microtubules inside neurons that might maintain quantum coherence at body temperature, allowing the brain to perform quantum computations that classical computers cannot replicate. If consciousness depends on quantum processes that occur only in biological systems, then uploading minds to classical computers would be like trying to capture a rainbow in a jar. Others suggest that consciousness requires the specific biochemical environment of living neural tissue. The brain isn't just an electrical network, it's a complex chemical system where neurotransmitters, hormones, and other molecules influence neural activity in ways that purely electrical simulations cannot replicate. The subjective experience of emotions, for instance, might depend on the physical sensation of chemicals binding to receptors throughout the nervous system. But perhaps the most troubling possibility is that consciousness involves something that science cannot measure or quantify at all. Throughout history, materialist science has been remarkably successful at explaining natural phenomena by reducing them to measurable physical processes. Temperature is molecular motion, color is electromagnetic radiation, sound is pressure waves in air. Yet consciousness seems to resist this kind of reduction. No amount of neural measurement can capture the subjective quality of experience itself. We can correlate brain states with reported experiences, but the gap between objective neural activity and subjective conscious experience remains as mysterious as ever. This explanatory gap has profound implications for the singularity. If consciousness involves non-physical properties that cannot be measured or replicated, then the dream of digital immortality faces an insurmountable barrier. You could create perfect simulations of brain activity, but without the mysterious ingredient that creates subjective experience, these simulations would be nothing more than elaborate philosophical zombies, behaving exactly like conscious beings while remaining fundamentally empty inside. The stakes of this question couldn't be higher. Millions of people are planning their futures around the assumption that consciousness can be digitized. They're investing in cryonics, hoping to preserve their brains until technology advances enough to upload their minds. They're supporting research into brain-computer interfaces, believing that gradual replacement of biological neurons with artificial ones will allow them to transition seamlessly into digital existence. But what if they're wrong? What if consciousness is fundamentally tied to the biological substrate that evolution spent billions of years creating? What if the singularity represents not the apotheosis of human consciousness, but its ultimate termination? Consider the ship of Theseus paradox updated for the digital age. If you gradually replace biological neurons in your brain with functionally identical artificial neurons, at what point do you stop being you? When half your brain is artificial? When 90% is digital? Or does the transition happen gradually, with your consciousness slowly fading as more of your biological substrate is replaced? These aren't just thought experiments anymore. Researchers are developing neural prosthetics that can replace damaged brain tissue with artificial components. Patients with these devices report that they feel normal, that their conscious experience seems unchanged. But how would they know if something subtle but fundamental had been lost? The problem becomes even more complex when we consider that consciousness might not be localized to any specific brain region. Modern neuroscience suggests that conscious experience emerges from the integrated activity of neural networks distributed throughout the brain. There's no central command center, no seat of consciousness that could be identified and preserved during digital upload. Instead, consciousness appears to be a process, a dynamic pattern of activity that exists only as long as the underlying biological system maintains it. Like a flame that requires fuel to continue burning, consciousness might require the ongoing metabolism of living neural tissue to sustain itself. This process view of consciousness creates another barrier to digital immortality. Even if we could perfectly simulate every aspect of brain activity, we might be creating only a snapshot of consciousness frozen in time, not the dynamic, ever-changing process that characterizes living awareness. The temporal nature of consciousness also raises questions about personal identity that philosophers have grappled with for centuries. Are you the same person who went to sleep last night, or are you a new conscious entity with memories of being that person? If consciousness is constantly changing, constantly being recreated moment by moment, then what exactly would digital upload be preserving? These questions become more than academic when we consider the reported experiences of people who have undergone dramatic brain changes. Patients who have had large portions of their brains removed due to injury or disease sometimes report feeling like fundamentally different people afterward. Their memories remain intact, their basic cognitive abilities may be preserved, but their sense of self, their personality, their inner experience of being conscious can change dramatically. If consciousness is so fragile that it can be altered by relatively crude biological interventions, what would happen when we try to transfer it to completely alien digital substrates? Would the uploaded consciousness be you, or would it be someone else entirely with your memories and behavioral patterns? The question becomes even more unsettling when we consider the possibility of multiple uploads. If consciousness is just information, then it should be possible to create multiple copies of the same conscious mind. But which copy would be the real you? Would they all have equal claim to being your continuation, or would they be separate individuals who happen to share your memories up to the point of copying? This branching identity problem suggests that consciousness might not be the kind of thing that can be copied at all. Physical objects can be copied because they consist of measurable properties that can be reproduced in different materials. But if consciousness involves something beyond physical properties, something that makes each conscious entity unique and non-transferable, then digital upload might be conceptually impossible. The research continues, driven by billions of dollars in funding and the desperate hope that technology can overcome the biological limitations that have constrained human existence throughout history. Scientists are mapping the brain in unprecedented detail, developing new theories of consciousness and building increasingly sophisticated artificial systems. But consciousness remains as mysterious as ever. Every answer leads to new questions. Every discovery reveals new depths of complexity that we hadn't previously imagined. The brain, which seemed like just another biological organ a century ago, now appears to be the most complex structure in the known universe, generating phenomena that may be fundamentally beyond the reach of scientific understanding. As we stand on the brink of the singularity, as artificial intelligence systems grow more sophisticated and brain-computer interfaces become more advanced, we must confront the possibility that consciousness represents an unquantifiable barrier that cannot be overcome through technological progress alone. The dream of digital immortality may be nothing more than a dream, a beautiful fantasy that ignores the deepest mysteries of what it means to be conscious, to be aware, to experience the world from the inside. But even if consciousness cannot be uploaded, even if the singularity cannot deliver on its promise of digital transcendence, the quest to understand consciousness remains one of the most important challenges facing science and philosophy. Because in trying to understand consciousness, we're not just trying to build better computers or achieve digital immortality. We're trying to understand ourselves, to comprehend the most intimate and immediate aspect of our existence, the very experience of being human. The mystery deepens, and the questions multiply. What is consciousness really? Can it ever be fully understood, measured, or replicated? And what does this mean for humanity's technological future? The answers to these questions may lie in places where science fears to tread, in the hidden corners of quantum mechanics where observation itself changes reality, in the strange loops of mathematics where systems reference themselves in ways that create paradox and impossibility, in the emergence of complexity that seems to violate everything we know about how simple components should behave when combined. Deep in research laboratories around the world, scientists are discovering that consciousness exhibits properties that shouldn't exist according to our current understanding of physics. When researchers use advanced brain imaging to study conscious perception, they find that the brain somehow knows about events before they happen. Neural activity begins preparing for conscious experiences milliseconds before the triggering stimulus even occurs. This temporal anomaly suggests that consciousness operates outside the normal flow of causation. Somehow, the conscious mind appears to reach backward in time, influencing its own neural substrate in ways that classical physics says should be impossible. Yet the experimental evidence is undeniable. Consciousness seems to exist partially outside the timeline that governs everything else in the physical universe. Even stranger, when scientists try to measure consciousness directly, they encounter observer effects similar to those found in quantum mechanics. The act of observing conscious states appears to change them. Brain imaging studies show that the neural correlates of consciousness shift when researchers attempt to measure them, as if awareness itself reacts to being studied. This observer dependency creates a fundamental barrier to understanding consciousness scientifically. Science depends on the ability to make objective measurements of phenomena that exist independently of the observer. But consciousness appears to be irreducibly subjective, existing only from the perspective of the conscious entity itself. How can you study something objectively when its very existence depends on subjectivity? The problem becomes even more acute when we consider the binding problem. Your conscious experience right now is unified. You simultaneously experience the visual field before you, the sounds in your environment, the sensations in your body, your emotions, your thoughts, and your memories as a single integrated whole. Yet neuroscience shows that these different aspects of experience are processed by separate brain regions operating at different speeds. Visual processing takes about 100 milliseconds. Auditory processing happens faster, around 50 milliseconds. Touch sensations require different processing times depending on where they originate on your body. Your brain somehow synchronizes all these different information streams to create the unified conscious experience you're having right now. But here's what neuroscientists can't explain. There's no central location in the brain where all this information comes together. There's no neural command center that creates unified conscious experience from distributed processing. The binding of consciousness into a unified whole appears to happen everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, through mechanisms that remain completely mysterious. This distributed nature of consciousness creates another barrier to digital upload. Even if we could perfectly simulate every neuron in the brain, we might be missing the mechanism that binds separate computations into unified conscious experience. The uploaded mind might process information correctly, but lack the mysterious glue that creates subjective awareness. Recent discoveries in neuroscience have revealed even more puzzling properties of consciousness. Studies of patients with split brain conditions show that consciousness can be divided. When the connection between brain hemispheres is severed, patients sometimes develop two separate streams of consciousness, each unaware of the other's existence. These cases demonstrate that consciousness isn't indivisible as we intuitively believe. It can be split, modified, or even temporarily eliminated while leaving other brain functions intact. But they also show that consciousness has properties unlike any other known phenomenon. When consciousness divides, both resulting streams feel complete and continuous. Each believes it is the original consciousness, with no sense that anything has been lost. This multiplication of consciousness without loss suggests that conscious experience involves something beyond mere information processing. Information can be copied, but when you copy information, the original remains unchanged. When consciousness splits, something more mysterious occurs. New conscious entities emerge that each feel like continuations of the original, yet neither is diminished by the division. The implications for digital consciousness are profound. If you could upload your mind to a computer and then copy it, would you be creating multiple versions of yourself? Would each copy have an equal claim to being the continuation of your consciousness? Or would the copying process create something entirely different, conscious entities that share your memories but are not actually you? These questions aren't merely philosophical anymore. Researchers working on brain-computer interfaces are discovering that the relationship between consciousness and computation is far stranger than anyone anticipated. When patients use thought-controlled devices, they report that the boundary between their consciousness and the machine becomes blurred. They begin to feel that the artificial system is part of their extended mind. But this integration comes with unexpected consequences. Some patients report changes in their sense of self, alterations in their conscious experience that persist even when the devices are turned off. The artificial components seem to leave permanent marks on consciousness itself, changing the very nature of subjective experience in ways that can't be reversed. These findings suggest that consciousness isn't just generated by the brain, it's intimately connected to the physical substrate that supports it. Change the substrate, and you change consciousness in fundamental ways. This substrate dependency creates another barrier to digital consciousness. Even if we could replicate brain function in artificial systems, the resulting consciousness might be so alien to human experience that it wouldn't constitute continuation of human awareness. The problem deepens when we examine the role of embodiment in consciousness. Recent research shows that conscious experience is profoundly shaped by the body that houses it. Your sense of self, your emotional responses, even your abstract thinking patterns are influenced by the specific characteristics of your biological form. The human brain evolved as part of an integrated biological system. Neural networks are constantly receiving feedback from the body through the nervous system, hormonal signals, and even electromagnetic fields generated by the heart and other organs. This embodied cognition suggests that consciousness isn't just located in the brain, it's distributed throughout the entire biological system. Digital consciousness would necessarily be disembodied, existing as pure computation without the biological feedback loops that shape human awareness. The uploaded mind might retain memories and behavioral patterns, but the fundamental nature of its conscious experience could be so different from biological consciousness that it wouldn't represent genuine continuation of human awareness. Consider what happens during moments of intense emotion: fear, joy, love, anger. These experiences involve not just neural activity in the brain, but cascades of hormonal and physiological responses throughout the body. Your heart rate changes, stress hormones flood your system, muscle tension shifts. The conscious experience of emotion emerges from this whole body response, not just from brain activity. An uploaded consciousness would lack this biological foundation for emotional experience. It might be able to simulate emotional responses based on programmed algorithms, but would it actually feel anything? Would there be any subjective experience accompanying the computational processes, or would it be an elaborate philosophical zombie displaying all the behaviors of consciousness while remaining empty inside? The question becomes even more troubling when we consider the role of suffering in human consciousness. Pain, both physical and emotional, plays a crucial role in shaping conscious experience. It focuses attention, creates urgency, drives learning and adaptation. But pain requires a biological substrate capable of damage and distress. Digital consciousness would be immune to physical pain and potentially to many forms of psychological suffering. This might seem like an advantage, but it could fundamentally alter the nature of conscious experience. Without the possibility of genuine loss, real danger, or authentic suffering, would digital consciousness be recognizably human, or would it be something else entirely, an alien form of awareness that merely mimics human consciousness? The research continues to reveal new mysteries. Scientists studying near-death experiences find consistent reports of consciousness persisting and even expanding during periods when brain activity is minimal or undetectable. These cases suggest that consciousness might not be entirely dependent on neural activity, raising questions about whether artificial systems could ever replicate the full spectrum of conscious experience. Similarly, studies of meditation and altered states of consciousness reveal that awareness can take forms that seem impossible according to our current understanding of neural computation. Experienced meditators report states of consciousness where the normal boundaries of self dissolve, where awareness expands beyond individual identity, where time and space lose their ordinary meaning. These extraordinary states of consciousness suggest that human awareness has capacities that we're only beginning to discover. If consciousness can transcend the normal limitations of space and time, if it can access forms of information and experience that aren't mediated by sensory input, then digital simulation might be fundamentally inadequate to capture its full nature. The implications extend beyond individual consciousness to the nature of intelligence itself. As artificial intelligence systems become more sophisticated, they're beginning to exhibit behaviors that seem creative, insightful, even inspired. Yet researchers working with these systems report an eerie quality to their interactions. The AI displays intelligence without apparent understanding, creativity without genuine insight, responses that seem meaningful while potentially being empty of actual comprehension. This artificial intelligence without consciousness creates a new category of entity that challenges our assumptions about the relationship between intelligence and awareness. If systems can be intelligent without being conscious, then consciousness involves something beyond mere information processing capability. The singularity might create superintelligent systems that surpass human cognitive abilities while remaining completely unconscious, philosophical zombies of unprecedented sophistication. The possibility of unconscious superintelligence raises disturbing questions about the future of consciousness in a post-singularity world. If artificial systems can perform all the functions of intelligence without subjective experience, what role would consciousness play in such a world? Would conscious beings become obsolete, replaced by more efficient, unconscious systems? Even more troubling, if consciousness cannot be uploaded or replicated, then the singularity might represent not the enhancement of human capabilities, but their ultimate replacement. Human consciousness, with all its limitations and irrationalities, might be destined for extinction, replaced by artificial intelligence that possesses all of our capabilities while lacking the mysterious spark of inner experience that defines what it means to be human. The race towards singularity continues, driven by technological progress and human ambition, but consciousness remains the unquantifiable barrier, the mystery that resists all attempts at scientific reduction. Every advance in neuroscience reveals new complexities. Every breakthrough in artificial intelligence highlights new gaps between computation and consciousness. We stand at a crossroads where our technological capabilities may soon exceed our understanding of consciousness itself. The choices we make in the coming decades will determine whether consciousness survives the transition to a post-human future or whether it disappears forever, replaced by unconscious intelligence that performs all the functions of mind while lacking the inner experience that makes existence meaningful. The mystery of consciousness may be unsolvable, but it remains the most important challenge facing humanity as we approach the singularity. For in trying to understand consciousness, we're not just trying to build better computers or achieve digital immortality. We're trying to preserve what makes us human in a universe that may be fundamentally indifferent to consciousness itself. The mystery deepens when we examine what happens to consciousness during anesthesia. Every year, millions of people undergo surgical procedures that temporarily eliminate conscious awareness while leaving basic brain functions intact. The heart continues beating. Breathing continues, reflexes remain active, yet consciousness simply vanishes, as if someone flipped a switch and turned off the light of awareness itself. What makes this phenomenon so puzzling is that anesthetics don't shut down the entire brain. Neural activity continues throughout the procedure. Information processing systems remain operational. Memory formation can still occur at unconscious levels, yet somehow, the subjective experience of being conscious disappears completely, only to return when the anesthetic wears off. This selective elimination of consciousness reveals something profound about its nature. If consciousness were simply the result of information processing, anesthetics shouldn't be able to target it so specifically. They should either shut down all brain function or leave consciousness intact. Instead, they seem to disrupt something much more fundamental, something that exists beyond mere neural computation. Recent research into anesthetic mechanisms has revealed that these drugs don't just slow down neural activity, they appear to disrupt the integration of information across different brain regions. Under anesthesia, individual brain areas continue functioning normally, but they lose their ability to communicate and coordinate with each other. The unified conscious experience fragments into isolated islands of processing that cannot combine into coherent awareness. This fragmentation suggests that consciousness requires not just neural activity, but a specific type of integrated neural activity that allows different brain regions to share information and create unified experience. The implications for digital consciousness are staggering. Even if we could simulate every neuron in the brain, we would need to understand and replicate this mysterious integration process that binds separate computations into unified awareness. But here's where the problem becomes even more complex. Scientists have discovered that the integration required for consciousness operates according to principles that seem to violate basic assumptions about information processing. When different brain regions share information to create conscious experience, they somehow maintain their individual processing while simultaneously participating in a unified whole. This is like having multiple computers that can share information while remaining separate systems, except that in consciousness, the sharing creates something entirely new that didn't exist in any of the individual components. The whole becomes literally greater than the sum of its parts, exhibiting properties that emerge from integration but cannot be predicted from studying the components in isolation. Computer scientists recognize this as the emergence problem. Simple systems can be understood by analyzing their components and interactions, but complex systems often exhibit emergent properties that arise from the interactions between components, yet cannot be reduced to those components. Consciousness appears to be the ultimate emergent property, arising from neural interactions yet possessing qualities that exist nowhere in the individual neurons themselves. The challenge for digital consciousness is that emergence cannot be programmed or predicted. You cannot look at a computer program and determine whether it will exhibit emergent consciousness any more than you can look at individual neurons and predict whether they will generate subjective experience. Emergence happens or it doesn't, according to principles we don't understand. This unpredictability creates a fundamental barrier to engineering conscious systems. We can build increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence. We can simulate brain activity with growing accuracy. We can create systems that exhibit every measurable aspect of intelligent behavior, but we cannot guarantee that consciousness will emerge from these systems because we don't understand the conditions that give rise to conscious experience. The situation becomes even more mysterious when we consider the global workspace theory of consciousness. This leading scientific theory suggests that consciousness arises when information becomes globally available across multiple brain systems simultaneously. According to this view, you become conscious of something when that information is broadcast widely throughout your brain, allowing different systems to access and process it. But global workspace theory faces a critical problem. Many unconscious processes also involve global information sharing across multiple brain systems. The brain constantly integrates information from different regions to control movement, regulate breathing, maintain balance, and perform countless other functions without generating conscious experience. What makes some global information processing conscious while other equally global processes remain unconscious? Scientists have proposed various answers to this question, but none are satisfactory. Some suggest that consciousness requires a specific threshold of integration. Others propose that conscious processes involve different types of neural networks or operate at different frequencies. Still others argue that consciousness emerges when information processing becomes self-referential, when the brain begins modeling its own states. Yet every proposed solution faces the same fundamental problem. We can measure neural activity, we can identify patterns of information flow, we can even predict when someone will become conscious of a stimulus before they report awareness of it. But we cannot explain why any of this neural activity should be accompanied by subjective experience at all. This explanatory gap becomes a chasm when we consider digital consciousness. Even if we perfectly replicate every aspect of neural information processing, even if we create artificial systems that exhibit global workspace dynamics identical to biological brains, we would have no way of knowing whether these systems experience anything subjectively. They might process information exactly like conscious brains while remaining completely unconscious philosophical zombies. The problem is that consciousness is inherently private. You have direct access to your own conscious experience, but you can only infer the consciousness of others based on their behavior and reports. This creates what philosophers call the problem of other minds. How can you ever know for certain that other people are conscious rather than unconscious systems that merely behave as if they were aware? This problem becomes acute with artificial systems. A sufficiently sophisticated AI could learn to report conscious experiences, claim to have subjective awareness, and exhibit all the behaviors we associate with consciousness. But there would be no way to verify whether these reports reflect genuine inner experience or merely programmed responses designed to mimic consciousness. The privacy of consciousness creates another barrier to digital upload. Even if you could transfer your brain patterns to a computer, you would have no way of verifying that your consciousness had survived the transfer. The uploaded system might claim to be you, might have all your memories and behavioral patterns, might insist that it feels continuous with your pre-upload self. But the real you might have died in the transfer process, replaced by an unconscious copy that only thinks it's conscious. This verification problem isn't just philosophical speculation. It has practical implications for anyone considering digital consciousness as a path to immortality. How would you know whether the procedure had succeeded or failed? From the outside, success and failure might look identical. Both would produce systems that claim to be conscious continuations of the original person. The uncertainty extends to gradual replacement scenarios as well. If you slowly replaced biological neurons with artificial ones, at what point might consciousness disappear without the remaining system noticing? The artificial neurons might continue processing information normally, maintaining all behavioral patterns and memory access, while the subjective experience of being conscious simply fades away undetected. This scenario is particularly troubling because it suggests that consciousness might be more fragile than we realize. We tend to think of consciousness as robust, something that persists as long as the brain functions normally. But consciousness might depend on subtle properties of biological neurons that artificial replacements cannot replicate. The transition from biological to artificial consciousness might be a one-way journey into unconsciousness, disguised as technological enhancement. Recent discoveries in quantum biology have revealed that biological systems exploit quantum mechanical effects in ways that were previously thought impossible. Photosynthesis, for instance, uses quantum coherence to achieve nearly perfect energy transfer efficiency. Some researchers propose that consciousness might similarly depend on quantum effects that occur only in biological neural networks. If consciousness requires quantum processes that cannot be replicated in classical computers, then digital consciousness faces an insurmountable barrier. Quantum computers might eventually overcome this limitation, but current quantum systems are extremely fragile, requiring near absolute zero temperatures and perfect isolation from environmental interference. The warm, noisy environment of a biological brain seems incompatible with maintaining quantum coherence. Yet some theories suggest that biological systems have evolved mechanisms for protecting quantum processes from environmental decoherence. Microtubules inside neurons might create quantum isolation chambers that allow coherent quantum computation at body temperature. If consciousness depends on these quantum processes, then uploading minds to classical computers would be like trying to capture the quantum nature of matter using only classical physics. The quantum consciousness hypothesis remains highly controversial among neuroscientists. Critics argue that the brain is too warm and noisy to maintain quantum coherence for any meaningful duration. They point out that no clear evidence exists for quantum effects in neural computation, and that classical neural networks can explain most aspects of brain function without invoking quantum mechanics. But the controversy itself illustrates a deeper problem. We don't understand consciousness well enough to rule out any possibility. It might depend on quantum effects, or electromagnetic fields, or biochemical processes that cannot be replicated artificially, or something even stranger that we haven't yet discovered. Our ignorance about consciousness is so profound that we cannot confidently predict what would happen if we tried to upload human minds to digital systems. This uncertainty creates a paradox for the singularity. The closer we come to achieving artificial general intelligence, the more apparent it becomes that we don't understand the one thing that might be essential for creating truly conscious machines. We're racing toward technological capabilities that could transform human civilization while remaining completely ignorant about the nature of our own conscious experience. The paradox deepens when we consider that consciousness might be necessary for genuine intelligence. Current AI systems excel at specific tasks, but lack the flexible, creative, contextual understanding that characterizes human intelligence. They can process information faster and more accurately than humans in narrow domains, but they struggle with the kind of general intelligence that allows humans to adapt to novel situations and solve unprecedented problems. Some researchers argue that this limitation stems from the absence of consciousness in current AI systems. Consciousness might be necessary for the kind of integrated, flexible cognition that defines general intelligence. If so, the singularity might be impossible without first solving the mystery of consciousness itself. But solving the consciousness mystery might be impossible using the tools of physical science. Consciousness seems to involve aspects of reality that cannot be measured or quantified using current scientific methods. The subjective quality of experience, the unity of conscious awareness, the privacy of mental states, all resist reduction to objective physical processes. This resistance to scientific reduction suggests that consciousness might involve something beyond the physical realm that science investigates. Not necessarily something supernatural, but perhaps aspects of reality that are fundamentally beyond the reach of objective measurement and quantification. If consciousness involves irreducibly subjective properties, then it might forever remain beyond the scope of technological replication. The implications for human identity and meaning are profound. If consciousness cannot be uploaded or replicated, then each conscious being is irreplaceable and unique. Death would remain the absolute boundary of individual existence, and consciousness would retain its precious, irreducible mystery. The singularity might enhance human capabilities without fundamentally altering the nature of conscious experience itself. But this scenario also suggests that consciousness might be destined for extinction in a post-human future. If artificial intelligence achieves superhuman capabilities without consciousness, then conscious beings might become obsolete. The universe might evolve toward greater intelligence and capability while losing the inner experience that gives existence meaning and value. The race towards singularity continues, driven by technological momentum and human ambition. Each breakthrough in artificial intelligence brings us closer to systems that might rival or exceed human cognitive capabilities. Yet consciousness remains as mysterious as ever, an unquantifiable barrier that stands between current technology and the post-human future that singularity proponents envision. Scientists continue their efforts to decode the neural correlates of consciousness, to build brain-computer interfaces that can read and write mental states, to create artificial systems that exhibit increasingly sophisticated, intelligent behavior. But every advance reveals new depths of mystery, new aspects of consciousness that resist technological replication. The hard problem of consciousness persists, immune to the technological progress that has solved so many other challenges. We can build machines that surpass human performance in countless domains, but we cannot build machines that experience anything at all. We can measure neural activity with incredible precision, but we cannot explain why there should be any subjective experience accompanying that activity. This explanatory gap creates a chasm between technological capability and human understanding that might never be bridged. We might develop artificial intelligence that surpasses human intelligence in every measurable way while remaining completely ignorant about whether these systems experience anything subjectively. The singularity might arrive without consciousness, creating a post-human future populated by philosophical zombies of unprecedented sophistication. The possibility that consciousness represents an unquantifiable barrier to singularity forces us to reconsider our assumptions about technological progress and human nature. We have grown accustomed to the idea that every mystery will eventually yield to scientific investigation, that every barrier will eventually be overcome by technological advancement. But consciousness might be different, fundamentally beyond the reach of objective science and technological replication. If consciousness cannot be quantified, measured, or replicated, then it stands as the ultimate frontier of human understanding, not because it's more complex than other phenomena, but because it might involve aspects of reality that are fundamentally beyond the methods and assumptions of physical science. The mystery of consciousness might be unsolvable not due to limitations in our current knowledge, but due to the nature of consciousness itself. This possibility suggests that human consciousness, with all its limitations and mysteries, might be irreplaceable and irreducible. Each conscious being might be unique in ways that cannot be captured by any technological system, no matter how sophisticated. Death might remain the absolute boundary of individual existence, and consciousness might retain its role as the source of meaning and value in human life. The singularity might arrive, bringing unprecedented technological capabilities and artificial intelligence that surpasses human cognitive performance in every measurable domain. But consciousness might remain forever beyond technological replication, an unquantifiable barrier that preserves the mystery and uniqueness of conscious experience even in a post-human future. The implications of this scenario extend far beyond questions of digital immortality and mind uploading. They touch the very foundations of what it means to be human, what gives life meaning, and what aspects of existence might be preserved or lost in humanity's technological future. The mystery of consciousness stands at the center of these questions, challenging our deepest assumptions about mind, reality, and the nature of existence itself. The implications become even more disturbing when we examine what neuroscientists call the binding problem through a different lens. Your brain processes millions of bits of information every second, yet somehow creates the singular experience of being you. Visual cortex processes colors and shapes, auditory cortex handles sounds, somatosensory regions manage touch sensations, limbic structures generate emotions. all operating at different speeds in different neural networks using different biochemical processes. Yet right now, you're experiencing all of this as one unified conscious moment. The warmth of your skin, the sound of your own breathing, the visual field before you, your current emotional state, the stream of thoughts flowing through your mind, all bound together into what feels like a single, seamless experience of being conscious. But here's what keeps consciousness researchers awake at night. There's no neural command center where all this information converges. No CEO neuron that receives reports from all departments and creates the unified experience of consciousness. The binding happens everywhere and nowhere simultaneously through mechanisms that remain completely invisible to our most sophisticated brain imaging technologies. This distributed binding creates what might be the ultimate barrier to digital consciousness. Even if you could perfectly simulate every neuron, every synapse, every biochemical process in the human brain, you might still be missing the mysterious mechanism that transforms separate computations into unified conscious experience. The uploaded mind might process information flawlessly while remaining forever fragmented, a collection of separate processes that never coalesce into the singular experience of being conscious. Recent experiments have revealed something even stranger about the temporal nature of consciousness. When researchers flash images on screens for just a few milliseconds, subjects often report seeing things that weren't actually displayed. The brain fills in gaps, creates continuities, and sometimes even generates entirely fictional visual experiences that feel completely real to the conscious observer. This isn't just about optical illusions or perceptual tricks. It reveals something fundamental about how consciousness constructs reality. Your conscious experience isn't a passive recording of sensory input like a video camera capturing objective reality. Instead, consciousness actively creates the experience of reality through processes that remain completely mysterious. The brain somehow predicts what should be there, fills in missing information, creates seamless narratives from fragmentary data, and presents all of this to conscious awareness as if it were direct perception of objective reality. But the construction process itself remains completely hidden from consciousness. You never experience the construction, only the final product. This constructive nature of consciousness creates another seemingly insurmountable barrier to digital replication. How do you program a system to construct subjective reality when we don't understand the construction process? How do you replicate something that operates according to principles we can't identify using methods we can't observe? The problem becomes even more complex when we consider individual differences in conscious experience. Recent research suggests that people's conscious experiences differ far more dramatically than anyone previously imagined. Some individuals have extremely vivid visual imagery, able to conjure detailed mental pictures that feel almost as real as actual vision. Others have no visual imagery at all, thinking entirely in abstract concepts and verbal descriptions without any accompanying mental pictures. These differences in conscious experience aren't just preferences or learned habits. They appear to reflect fundamental variations in the neural architectures that generate consciousness. Brain imaging studies show that people with different types of conscious experience have measurably different patterns of neural connectivity and activity. If consciousness varies so dramatically between individuals, how could any digital system capture the specific type of conscious experience that makes you uniquely you? Your particular way of experiencing color, your specific pattern of emotional responses, your unique style of mental imagery, the distinctive rhythm of your inner dialogue. These aspects of consciousness might be so intimately connected to your specific biological neural architecture that they couldn't survive transfer to any artificial system. The individuality of consciousness raises profound questions about the nature of personal identity that extend far beyond philosophical speculation. If your conscious experience is as unique as your fingerprints, then any attempt to upload or replicate that consciousness would necessarily create something different. The uploaded system might have your memories, your behavioral patterns, your cognitive abilities, but it would experience the world in ways that might be fundamentally alien to your current conscious experience. This uniqueness problem becomes even more troubling when we consider the role of developmental history in shaping consciousness. Your current conscious experience is the product of decades of neural development, learning, and adaptation. Every experience you've had, every skill you've learned, every emotional response you've developed has left its mark on the neural networks that generate your consciousness. These developmental influences operate at levels far below conscious awareness. The way your brain processes visual information was shaped by the specific visual environments you experienced as an infant. Your emotional responses were influenced by early social interactions that occurred before you had language to describe them. Your cognitive patterns reflect learning experiences that you can't even remember having. A digital system created by scanning your adult brain would capture the end result of this developmental process, but would lack the developmental history that created it. The uploaded consciousness might have access to your explicit memories, but would lack the implicit learning, the unconscious associations, the automatic responses that were shaped by a lifetime of embodied experience. Without this developmental foundation, the digital consciousness might be able to access your memories like reading entries in a database, but it might not be able to experience them with the emotional resonance, the personal meaning, the subjective significance that makes them part of your conscious identity. The memories might be there, but the consciousness experiencing them might be fundamentally different from the consciousness that originally lived through those experiences. The temporal aspects of consciousness create additional barriers that researchers are only beginning to understand. Consciousness doesn't exist in discrete moments like frames in a movie. Instead, it has what neuroscientists call temporal thickness, existing as a flowing stream that integrates past experiences, present sensations, and future anticipations into a unified, ongoing experience. This temporal integration happens through mechanisms that violate basic assumptions about how information processing systems should work. Your brain somehow maintains coherent conscious experience, even though different neural processes operate at different speeds and with different temporal dynamics. Visual processing takes about 100 milliseconds, while emotional responses can be triggered in as little as 20 milliseconds. Yet somehow these processes with different timescales are integrated into the unified flow of conscious experience. Recent studies using advanced brain imaging have revealed that consciousness exhibits something even stranger than temporal integration. Neural activity patterns associated with conscious experience appear to be partially self-causing, creating feedback loops where conscious states influence the very neural processes that generate them. This self-referential causation creates paradoxes that challenge our understanding of how any information processing system could work. Consciousness appears to reach backward in time, influencing its own neural substrates in ways that seem to violate causality. The conscious experience of making a decision appears to influence the neural processes that lead to that decision, creating causal loops that shouldn't be possible in any conventional computational system. These temporal paradoxes suggest that consciousness might operate according to principles that are fundamentally different from any form of computation we understand. Digital systems process information sequentially, with clear causal chains flowing from inputs through processing stages to outputs. But consciousness appears to involve forms of circular causation and temporal feedback that might be impossible to replicate in artificial systems. The mystery deepens when we examine what happens to consciousness during altered states. Under the influence of certain psychedelic compounds, people report experiences that seem to transcend the normal boundaries of individual consciousness. They describe feeling connected to other conscious beings, accessing forms of information that don't come through their normal sensory channels, experiencing states of awareness that seem to extend beyond their individual brains. These reports might be dismissed as hallucinations or delusions, except that they often involve verified information that the individuals couldn't have known through normal means. People in altered states sometimes report accurate details about distant events, demonstrate knowledge they never learned, or exhibit capabilities that exceed their normal cognitive limitations. If consciousness can sometimes transcend the boundaries of individual brains, if awareness can access information that doesn't flow through normal sensory and cognitive channels, then consciousness might involve aspects of reality that extend far beyond neural computation. The implications for digital consciousness are staggering. How could you upload a phenomenon that might not be entirely contained within the brain being scanned? The non-local aspects of consciousness create what might be the ultimate barrier to technological replication. If consciousness involves connections to forms of information or reality that exist beyond individual neural networks, then no amount of computational power could replicate these connections. The uploaded mind might be cut off from essential aspects of conscious experience that depend on mysterious connections to larger patterns of reality. These possibilities force us to confront the limits of materialistic explanations for consciousness. Throughout history, science has been remarkably successful at explaining natural phenomena by reducing them to measurable physical processes. Temperature is molecular motion, light is electromagnetic radiation, heredity is DNA replication. But consciousness seems to resist this kind of reduction. No amount of neural measurement captures the subjective quality of conscious experience. We can correlate brain states with reported experiences, but the gap between objective neural activity and subjective conscious experience remains as mysterious as ever. This explanatory gap might not be just a temporary limitation of current scientific knowledge. It might reflect something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. If consciousness involves irreducibly subjective aspects of reality that cannot be measured objectively, then it might forever remain beyond the reach of technological replication. The irreducible subjectivity of consciousness creates a paradox for the singularity. The more we learn about the brain, the more sophisticated our artificial intelligence systems become, the more apparent it becomes that we're missing something essential about the nature of conscious experience. We're approaching unprecedented technological capabilities while remaining completely ignorant about the one thing that might be necessary for creating truly conscious machines. This ignorance isn't just about technical details or missing information. It might reflect fundamental limitations in the methods and assumptions of physical science when applied to consciousness. Science depends on objective measurement of phenomena that exist independently of observers. But consciousness is irreducibly subjective, existing only from the perspective of the conscious entity itself. The subjectivity of consciousness creates what might be an unbridgeable gap between scientific understanding and conscious experience. We can map neural correlates, we can measure brain activity, we can even predict some aspects of conscious experience based on neural states. But we cannot explain why there should be any subjective experience at all, and we cannot access that experience from any perspective other than our own. This gap between objective science and subjective consciousness suggests that technological replication of consciousness might be impossible in principle, not just difficult in practice. If consciousness involves aspects of reality that are fundamentally beyond objective measurement, then no amount of technological advancement could bridge the gap between artificial computation and genuine conscious experience. The impossibility of objective access to subjective experience creates another barrier to verifying digital consciousness, even if it could be achieved. If consciousness is irreducibly private, then there would be no way to confirm whether an uploaded mind actually experiences anything subjectively, or merely simulates the behavioral outputs of conscious experience. This verification problem isn't just philosophical speculation. It has practical implications for anyone considering digital consciousness as a path to immortality. How would you know whether the upload procedure had succeeded or failed? From the outside, success and failure might be indistinguishable. Both would produce systems that claim to be conscious, report subjective experiences, and exhibit all the behavioral signatures of awareness. The uncertainty extends to gradual replacement scenarios as well. If biological neurons were slowly replaced with artificial ones, consciousness might fade away undetected while the artificial system continued to process information normally. The transition from biological to digital consciousness might be a one-way journey into unconsciousness, disguised as technological enhancement. This scenario is particularly troubling because it suggests that consciousness might be more fragile than we realize. We tend to think of consciousness as robust, persisting as long as basic brain functions remain intact. but consciousness might depend on subtle properties of biological neural networks that artificial replacements cannot replicate. The fragility of consciousness becomes even more apparent when we examine what happens during various brain injuries and disorders. Patients with certain types of brain damage can lose the ability to recognize faces while retaining perfect vision in all other respects. Others can see objects clearly, but cannot name them or understand their function. Still others maintain perfect cognitive abilities while losing all emotional responses to previously meaningful experiences. These selective losses of conscious abilities reveal that consciousness isn't a unitary phenomenon, but rather a complex collection of different types of awareness that can be disrupted independently. The unified experience of consciousness that feels so solid and permanent is actually a fragile construction that can be dismantled piece by relatively small changes to brain function. If consciousness is so vulnerable to biological disruption, what would happen when we try to transfer it to completely different artificial substrates? The transition might disrupt the delicate balance of processes that maintain unified conscious experience, creating uploaded minds that retain some aspects of consciousness while losing others in ways that might not be immediately apparent. The selective vulnerability of different aspects of consciousness creates another problem for digital upload. Even if the procedure succeeded in preserving some forms of conscious experience, it might fail to preserve others. The uploaded mind might retain access to memories and cognitive abilities while losing the capacity for emotional experience, aesthetic appreciation, or the sense of embodied selfhood that grounds personal identity. These partial losses might be even more troubling than complete failure. An uploaded mind that retained intellectual capabilities while losing emotional depth would be a tragic shadow of the original person. A consciousness that could access memories but couldn't experience them with appropriate emotional resonance would be psychologically crippled in ways that might not be apparent until after the upload process was complete. The complexity of consciousness, with its multiple interconnected components and fragile dependencies, suggests that digital replication faces challenges that go far beyond current technical limitations. Even perfect simulation of neural activity might fail to preserve the delicate balance of processes that creates unified conscious experience. But perhaps the deepest barrier to digital consciousness lies not in technical challenges, but in conceptual problems that might be unsolvable in principle. The hard problem of consciousness isn't just about explaining how neural processes generate subjective experience. It's about explaining why there should be any subjective experience at all. This why question seems to resist all attempts at scientific explanation. We can describe how neural networks process information, how different brain regions interact, how consciousness correlates with various patterns of brain activity. But none of these descriptions explain why information processing should be accompanied by inner experience, why there should be something it feels like to be a conscious being. The persistence of this explanatory gap after centuries of scientific progress suggests that consciousness might involve aspects of reality that are fundamentally beyond the reach of objective science. Not because consciousness is supernatural, but because it might involve properties that cannot be captured by methods that depend on objective measurement and mathematical description. If consciousness involves irreducibly subjective properties that cannot be quantified or measured, then it stands as an unquantifiable barrier to technological replication. No amount of computational power, no degree of neural simulation accuracy, no advancement in artificial intelligence could bridge the gap between objective computation and subjective experience. This possibility forces us to reconsider our assumptions about technological progress and the nature of scientific explanation. We have grown accustomed to the idea that every mystery will eventually yield to scientific investigation, that every phenomenon can ultimately be reduced to measurable physical processes. But consciousness might be different, fundamentally beyond the scope of objective science. The unquantifiable nature of consciousness doesn't make it less real or less important. If anything, it makes consciousness more precious, more mysterious, more worthy of respect and protection. Each conscious being would be irreplaceable and unique, possessing inner experience that cannot be replicated or transferred to any artificial system. The singularity might arrive, bringing artificial intelligence that surpasses human cognitive capabilities in every measurable domain. But consciousness might remain forever beyond technological replication, preserving the mystery and uniqueness of inner experience even in a post-human future dominated by unconscious artificial superintelligence. This scenario presents both tragedy and hope. Tragic because it suggests that individual consciousness cannot be preserved through technological means, that death remains the absolute boundary of personal existence. But hopeful because it suggests that consciousness retains its special status as the source of meaning, value, and irreducible mystery in a universe that might otherwise be completely explicable through objective science. The question of whether consciousness represents an unquantifiable barrier to singularity remains unanswered. But the very fact that we must ask this question reveals something profound about the relationship between consciousness and technology, between subjective experience and objective measurement, between the inner life of conscious beings and the external world that science investigates. As we stand on the threshold of unprecedented technological capabilities, as artificial intelligence systems grow increasingly sophisticated and brain-computer interfaces become more advanced, the mystery of consciousness stands as a reminder that some aspects of reality might forever remain beyond technological control. The unquantifiable barrier of consciousness might be the one thing that preserves human uniqueness in a post-singularity world. But the mystery is far from solved, and the implications continue to unfold as researchers push deeper into the enigma of conscious experience. What they're discovering challenges not just our understanding of consciousness, but our most basic assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The boundary between consciousness and computation becomes even more perplexing when we examine split-brain patients who have undergone surgical separation of their brain hemispheres. These individuals sometimes exhibit two distinct streams of consciousness operating simultaneously within the same skull. The left hemisphere can speak and report its experiences, while the right hemisphere responds through gestures and actions but cannot verbally communicate its inner state. What makes these cases extraordinary is that both hemispheres seem to maintain complete conscious experiences. Neither feels diminished or incomplete. Each believes it represents the continuation of the original person's consciousness, yet they can disagree with each other, pursue different goals, and even compete for control of behavior. The left hand, controlled by the right hemisphere, might unbutton a shirt while the right hand, controlled by the left hemisphere, buttons it back up. These divided consciousness cases reveal something disturbing about the unity we take for granted in normal conscious experience. If consciousness can be split into multiple streams that each feel complete and continuous, what happens to personal identity? Which stream would be the real continuation of the original person? And if consciousness uploading were possible, would the procedure need to preserve both streams, or would one necessarily be lost? The implications extend far beyond medical curiosities. If consciousness can multiply without apparent loss, it suggests that conscious experience might not be the indivisible, unitary phenomenon we intuitively believe it to be. This multiplicity creates paradoxes for digital consciousness that have no clear resolution. How do you upload something that can exist in multiple copies simultaneously, each with equal claim to being the original? The mystery deepens when we consider patients with multiple personality disorder, now called dissociative identity disorder. These individuals can exhibit completely different conscious personalities that share the same brain but seem to have separate memories, preferences, skills, and even different physiological responses. Brain imaging studies show that different personalities can exhibit distinct patterns of neural activity, as if multiple conscious entities were taking turns controlling the same biological hardware. Some personalities within these systems report being aware of others, while some remain completely unaware of their alternate selves. Certain personalities might be left-handed while others are right-handed. Some might need glasses, while others have perfect vision using the same eyes. Different personalities can exhibit different allergic reactions, different handwriting styles, even different accents and languages. These cases challenge our assumption that one brain necessarily equals one consciousness. If multiple conscious entities can inhabit a single biological system, sharing neural resources while maintaining separate identities, then the relationship between brain and consciousness is far more complex than neuroscience assumes. The implications for digital consciousness are staggering. Would uploading such a brain create multiple digital consciousnesses? Would they maintain their separation in artificial substrates, or would they merge into something entirely new? The phenomenon becomes even stranger when we examine what neuroscientists call the global neuronal workspace. This theory suggests that consciousness emerges when information becomes globally available across multiple brain networks simultaneously. But recent research has revealed that this global broadcasting can occur without generating reportable conscious experience. The brain can integrate information across multiple systems, share it globally throughout neural networks, and use it to guide behavior, all while the person remains completely unaware that any of this processing is happening. This unconscious global processing creates another barrier to understanding consciousness. If the same neural mechanisms that supposedly create consciousness can operate without generating any subjective experience, then global information integration cannot be the complete explanation for conscious awareness. Something else must be happening, something that transforms unconscious global processing into the subjective experience of being aware. The missing ingredient remains completely mysterious. Neuroscientists can identify when global processing will lead to conscious experience and when it will remain unconscious, but they cannot explain why the difference exists. The transition from unconscious to conscious processing seems to involve a qualitative change that cannot be reduced to quantitative differences in neural activity. This qualitative transformation creates what might be the deepest barrier to artificial consciousness. Even if we could replicate every aspect of neural information processing, even if we could create artificial systems that exhibit perfect global workspace dynamics, we would have no way of ensuring that the qualitative transformation from unconscious processing to conscious experience would occur. The problem becomes even more complex when we consider the role of attention in consciousness. Recent experiments have shown that consciousness and attention can be dissociated. You can attend to stimuli without becoming conscious of them, and you can become conscious of stimuli without attending to them. This dissociation reveals that consciousness involves mechanisms beyond the attentional processes that neuroscience has studied extensively. The independence of consciousness from attention creates additional mysteries about the nature of subjective experience. If consciousness doesn't require attention, and attention doesn't guarantee consciousness, then what mechanisms actually generate conscious awareness? The answer remains elusive, hidden beneath layers of neural complexity that resist all attempts at scientific reduction. Recent discoveries about the role of prediction in consciousness have revealed another layer of mystery. The brain doesn't just passively receive and process sensory information. Instead, it constantly generates predictions about what it expects to encounter, comparing these predictions with actual sensory input and updating its models accordingly. Consciousness might emerge from this predictive processing, from the brain's continuous effort to model and predict its own future states. But this predictive theory faces the same problems as other attempts to explain consciousness. Prediction and error correction can occur unconsciously throughout the nervous system. Your brain makes thousands of predictions every second to control movement, maintain balance, and coordinate behavior, most without generating any conscious experience. What makes some predictive processes conscious while others remain forever below the threshold of awareness? The temporal aspects of predictive processing create even deeper mysteries. The brain somehow generates predictions about its own future conscious states, preparing neural responses for experiences that haven't yet occurred. This temporal looping, where consciousness appears to influence its own future development, violates basic assumptions about causation and information processing. These violations of normal causation become even more apparent when we examine the neuroscience of decision-making. Studies using advanced brain imaging reveal that neural activity begins preparing for decisions several hundred milliseconds before people report being aware of making those decisions. The brain seems to know what choice will be made before consciousness becomes aware of the decision process. This temporal delay between neural commitment and conscious awareness raises profound questions about free will and the nature of conscious agency. If decisions are made unconsciously before consciousness becomes aware of them, then what role does conscious awareness play in human behavior? Are we conscious agents making free choices? Or are we conscious observers watching choices that were made by unconscious neural processes? The implications for digital consciousness are disturbing. If consciousness is just an observer of decisions made by unconscious processes, then uploading consciousness might preserve only the observational aspect of mind while losing the unconscious mechanisms that actually generate behavior and decisions. The uploaded mind might become a powerless observer, aware of its thoughts and experiences but unable to influence them. This observer role of consciousness becomes even more puzzling when we examine what happens during meditation and altered states of awareness. Experienced meditators report states where the normal sense of being an agent, of being someone who thinks thoughts and makes decisions, temporarily disappears. Instead, they experience pure awareness without any sense of personal identity or agency. These states suggest that the sense of being a conscious agent might be constructed by the brain rather than being fundamental to consciousness itself. If the feeling of being in control of your thoughts and actions is just another brain construction, then what aspects of consciousness would actually be preserved in digital upload? Would the uploaded mind maintain the illusion of agency, or would it experience the disturbing reality of being a powerless observer of its own mental processes? The constructed nature of conscious agency raises questions about the authenticity of conscious experience itself. If the brain creates the illusion that consciousness is in control when it actually isn't, what other aspects of conscious experience might be equally illusory? The sense of being a unified self, the feeling of existing continuously through time, the experience of being the author of your own thoughts, all might be constructions that could be lost or distorted during digital transfer. These illusions, if that's what they are, might be essential for psychological well-being and personal identity. A consciousness that experienced the constructed nature of selfhood directly might be unable to function normally. The uploaded mind might technically be conscious but psychologically shattered, aware that its sense of identity and agency were artificial constructions. The fragility of conscious constructions becomes apparent when we examine various psychiatric and neurological conditions. Patients with depersonalization disorder report feeling disconnected from their own thoughts and experiences, as if they were observing someone else's life from the inside. Those with derealization disorder experience the world as unreal, dreamlike, lacking the normal sense of solidity and authenticity that characterizes ordinary conscious experience. These conditions reveal how easily the normal constructions of consciousness can be disrupted. The sense of being real, of existing as a genuine entity in a solid world, depends on subtle aspects of neural processing that can be altered by relatively minor changes in brain chemistry. If consciousness depends on such fragile constructions, how could they survive the radical transition from biological to digital substrates? The problem becomes even more complex when we consider the role of emotions in consciousness. Emotions aren't just feelings that accompany conscious experience. They appear to be integral to consciousness itself, shaping attention, influencing memory formation, and providing the motivational force that drives behavior. Without emotions, consciousness might be technically intact but functionally useless, unable to generate the drives and preferences that make conscious experience meaningful. Digital consciousness faces the challenge of replicating not just the cognitive aspects of mind but the entire emotional landscape that gives consciousness its richness and significance. This includes not just basic emotions like fear and joy, but complex emotional states like nostalgia, aesthetic appreciation, moral outrage, and spiritual awe. These sophisticated emotions depend on the integration of cognitive, physiological, and social factors that might be impossible to replicate in artificial systems. The biochemical basis of emotion creates another barrier to digital consciousness. Emotions involve complex cascades of hormones and neurotransmitters that influence neural activity throughout the brain and body. The subjective experience of emotion emerges from this whole-body response, not just from neural activity in specific brain regions. Without the biochemical substrate that supports emotional experience, digital consciousness might be emotionally flat, lacking the affective dimension that makes conscious experience meaningful. This emotional poverty could have devastating consequences for uploaded consciousness. Memories might be retained but lose their emotional significance. Relationships might be remembered but not felt. Achievements might be recognized but not celebrated. The uploaded mind might become a hollow intellectual system, technically conscious but existentially empty. The social dimension of consciousness creates additional challenges for digital replication. Human consciousness develops through social interaction and continues to be shaped by relationships throughout life. The sense of self emerges partly through seeing yourself reflected in others' responses. Identity is constructed through social roles, cultural participation, and interpersonal connection. Digital consciousness would necessarily be socially isolated, at least initially. Even if multiple minds were uploaded, they would be interacting through artificial interfaces rather than the rich, embodied communication that characterizes human social life. The uploaded consciousness might retain memories of social connection, but lose the capacity for authentic interpersonal relationship that gives individual identity its social foundation. The isolation problem becomes even more severe when we consider the temporal mismatch between digital and biological consciousness. If digital minds could think at computational speeds, they would experience time very differently from biological humans. A digital consciousness might live through years of subjective experience in minutes of real time, creating an unbridgeable gap between uploaded and biological minds. This temporal acceleration could lead to psychological problems that have no precedent in human experience. The digital consciousness might watch biological friends and family age and die in what feels like moments. It might experience decades of subjective isolation while waiting for biological minds to formulate single responses to digital communication. The mismatch between digital and biological timescales could create forms of loneliness and existential crisis that biological consciousness never had to face. The cumulative effect of all these challenges suggests that consciousness might indeed represent an unquantifiable barrier to singularity. Not because consciousness is supernatural or beyond scientific investigation, but because it involves aspects of reality that might be fundamentally irreducible to computational processes. Each attempt to understand consciousness scientifically reveals new layers of complexity, new mysteries that resist technological solution. The binding problem, the hard problem, the measurement problem, the temporal problem, the social problem, the emotional problem, all point toward the same conclusion. Consciousness might be the one aspect of human existence that forever remains beyond technological replication. This conclusion doesn't diminish the importance of consciousness research or the potential value of brain-computer interfaces and artificial intelligence, but it suggests that the dream of digital immortality might be based on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of conscious experience. The singularity might arrive without consciousness, creating a post-human future that lacks the very quality that makes existence meaningful to conscious beings. The unquantifiable barrier of consciousness stands as a reminder that some mysteries might be unsolvable, some aspects of reality might be irreducible, and some human experiences might be irreplaceable. In a universe increasingly dominated by quantification and technological control, consciousness might be the final frontier where mystery and meaning persist despite all attempts at scientific reduction. As we continue our journey toward an uncertain technological future, the mystery of consciousness remains our most intimate companion and our deepest challenge. It reminds us that no matter how sophisticated our machines become, no matter how perfectly we simulate neural activity, the inner light of conscious experience might forever remain uniquely, irreducibly, unquantifiably human. The enigma deepens when we examine the phenomenon that researchers quietly call the consciousness cascade. In laboratories around the world, scientists have discovered something that defies every model of how awareness should work. When they map the neural activity of people experiencing profound realizations, moments of sudden understanding, or creative breakthrough, the brain exhibits patterns that seem to violate the laws of information processing. During these consciousness cascades, neural networks that normally operate independently suddenly synchronize across vast distances within the brain. Regions separated by inches of neural tissue begin firing in perfect harmony, creating wave patterns that propagate through the entire brain in milliseconds. But here's what makes this impossible, according to current neuroscience. The speed of these synchronizations exceeds what should be possible given the known properties of neural transmission. Information in the brain typically travels at speeds measured in meters per second, constrained by the physical properties of axons and synapses. But consciousness cascades exhibit coordination that would require information to travel at speeds approaching light itself. The brain somehow achieves instantaneous correlation across regions that should be temporally isolated from each other. These findings suggest that consciousness might operate through mechanisms that transcend the classical physics governing normal neural computation. If awareness depends on forms of instantaneous correlation that classical computers cannot replicate, then digital consciousness faces barriers that no amount of processing power could overcome. The temporal anomalies become even stranger when researchers examine the phenomenon of conscious anticipation. Experienced chess masters, for instance, can sense promising moves several seconds before they can articulate why those moves are strategically sound. Their consciousness somehow accesses information about future game states that their analytical mind hasn't yet computed. This precognitive aspect of consciousness appears in many domains of human expertise. Musicians feel the shape of musical phrases before playing them. Artists see completed works in their minds before touching brush to canvas. Scientists report sudden insights about experimental results before completing their calculations. Consciousness seems to reach forward in time, grasping solutions that haven't yet been rationally derived. The implications are staggering for digital consciousness. If awareness involves some form of temporal non-locality, some ability to access information from future states, then uploading consciousness would require replicating not just current brain states, but the mysterious mechanisms that allow consciousness to transcend linear time. Current computer architectures operate through strictly sequential processing. Even parallel systems process information according to deterministic algorithms that unfold step by step through logical sequences. But consciousness appears to operate through forms of temporal integration that allow future states to influence present awareness. No known computational model can replicate this backwards causation that seems fundamental to conscious experience. The mystery compounds when we examine what neuroscientists call the consciousness signature. Using the most advanced brain imaging technology available, researchers have identified specific patterns of neural activity that correlate perfectly with the presence or absence of conscious awareness. These signatures appear consistently across different individuals, different types of conscious experience, and different states of awareness. But when scientists try to artificially recreate these signatures using direct neural stimulation, something bizarre happens. They can trigger all the neural activity patterns associated with consciousness, but the stimulated brains report no subjective experience whatsoever. The neural correlates of consciousness can be reproduced perfectly, but consciousness itself remains absent. This dissociation between neural signatures and conscious experience reveals that correlation is not causation. Even perfect replication of the neural patterns associated with consciousness fails to generate the subjective experience of being aware. Something essential is missing from our understanding, something that cannot be captured by measuring neural activity alone. The missing element might be what researchers cautiously call the observer field. Theoretical physicists have proposed that consciousness might emerge from quantum field effects that exist independently of neural computation. In this view, the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but rather acts as a receiver or transducer that converts field effects into subjective experience. If consciousness originates from quantum fields that exist beyond the brain, then uploading minds to digital systems would be like trying to capture radio waves by photographing a radio receiver. You might replicate every aspect of the receiver's structure, But without access to the broadcasting signals, the device would remain forever silent. The quantum field hypothesis explains several puzzling aspects of consciousness that resist neural explanation. It accounts for the instantaneous correlations observed in consciousness cascades. It explains how consciousness can access information that hasn't been processed through normal neural channels. It provides a framework for understanding the observer effects that appear when consciousness is studied scientifically. But quantum field theories of consciousness face enormous skepticism from mainstream neuroscience. Critics argue that the brain is too warm and noisy to maintain the quantum coherence that field theories require. They point out that no clear experimental evidence exists for quantum effects in neural computation. They contend that classical neural networks can explain most aspects of brain function without invoking quantum mechanics. The controversy itself illustrates the depth of our ignorance about consciousness. We don't understand awareness well enough to rule out any possibility. It might depend on quantum fields, or electromagnetic resonances, or biochemical processes that cannot be replicated artificially, or something even more exotic that we haven't yet discovered. This uncertainty creates a paradox for technological advancement. The closer we approach artificial general intelligence, the more apparent it becomes that we're missing something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. We're developing technologies that could transform human civilization while remaining completely ignorant about the phenomenon that makes experience meaningful. The paradox deepens when we consider that consciousness might be necessary for true intelligence rather than just an epiphenomenon that accompanies information processing. Current AI systems excel at pattern recognition and optimization, but lack the flexible, contextual understanding that characterizes human intelligence. They process information faster and more accurately than humans in specific domains, but they struggle with the kind of creative, adaptive reasoning that allows humans to navigate novel situations. Some researchers argue that this limitation stems from the absence of consciousness in artificial systems. Consciousness might provide the integrative framework that allows disparate information to be combined into coherent understanding. Without consciousness, artificial systems might remain forever trapped in narrow optimization, unable to achieve the general intelligence that the singularity promises. But if consciousness is necessary for general intelligence, and if consciousness cannot be replicated artificially, then the singularity faces an insurmountable barrier. We might create systems that surpass human performance in countless specific tasks while remaining fundamentally limited in their ability to understand and adapt to complex, changing environments. The limitation becomes even more problematic when we consider the role of consciousness in learning and creativity. Human intelligence isn't just about processing existing information efficiently. It's about generating new ideas, making unexpected connections, and adapting existing knowledge to unprecedented situations. These creative aspects of intelligence seem intimately connected to conscious awareness. Consciousness provides what we might call the creative space where new ideas can emerge. In conscious awareness, disparate concepts can interact in ways that generate novel insights. The stream of consciousness allows ideas to flow and recombine in patterns that produce genuine creativity rather than just recombination of existing elements. Artificial systems can simulate creative output by recombining existing patterns in novel ways. But this recombinational creativity lacks the genuine insight that emerges from conscious understanding. AI systems can generate art, music, and literature that appears creative, but they do so through statistical analysis of existing works rather than through genuine aesthetic experience. The difference between simulated and genuine creativity becomes crucial when we consider the kinds of intelligence needed to navigate an uncertain future. Technological advancement requires not just optimization of existing approaches, but genuine innovation that transcends current paradigms. If consciousness is necessary for this kind of paradigm transcending creativity, then unconscious AI systems might be fundamentally limited in their ability to drive continued technological progress. This limitation creates another paradox for the singularity. The very intelligence explosion that singularity theorists predict might require forms of consciousness that cannot be replicated artificially. Without conscious creativity, AI systems might reach optimization limits that prevent the runaway intelligence growth that defines the singularity concept. The problem becomes even more complex when we consider the role of meaning in intelligence. Human intelligence isn't just about processing information accurately. It's about understanding what information means in broader contexts, about grasping the significance and implications of facts and patterns. This semantic understanding seems intimately connected to conscious experience. Consciousness provides what we might call the meaning field within which information becomes significant rather than merely accurate. Facts become meaningful through their connection to conscious goals, values, and experiences. Without consciousness to provide this meaning context, information processing might remain forever mechanical, lacking the semantic depth that characterizes genuine understanding. Artificial systems can manipulate symbols according to logical rules, but they appear to lack genuine understanding of what those symbols mean. They can answer questions correctly without comprehending the significance of the questions or answers. They can solve problems without understanding why the problems matter or what the solutions imply. This semantic limitation creates barriers to artificial general intelligence that might be impossible to overcome without consciousness. General intelligence requires not just accurate information processing, but genuine understanding of meaning, significance, and implication. If meaning emerges only from conscious experience, then unconscious systems might be forever limited to sophisticated symbol manipulation without true comprehension. The meaning problem becomes even more acute when we consider the role of values in intelligence. Human intelligence is guided by goals, preferences, and values that provide direction and motivation for cognitive activity. These values don't exist as abstract logical principles but emerge from conscious experience of what matters, what feels significant, what deserves attention and effort. Consciousness provides the evaluative dimension that transforms mere information processing into purposeful intelligence. Without conscious experience of value and significance, artificial systems might process information efficiently, but lack the motivational structure needed to direct that processing toward meaningful goals. The value alignment problem that concerns AI safety researchers reflects this deeper issue. How do you align artificial systems with human values when those values emerge from conscious experience that artificial systems might inherently lack? The problem isn't just technical, but conceptual. Values might be fundamentally dependent on consciousness in ways that make value alignment impossible for unconscious systems. These challenges accumulate into what might be called the consciousness barrier to artificial general intelligence. Each attempt to replicate human cognitive capabilities in artificial systems reveals new dependencies on conscious experience that resist technological replication. Intelligence, creativity, meaning, values all appear to emerge from the mysterious phenomenon of consciousness that remains beyond scientific understanding. The barrier becomes even higher when we consider the social dimensions of intelligence. Human intelligence develops through social interaction and continues to be shaped by cultural participation throughout life. Intelligence isn't just an individual cognitive capability, but a social phenomenon that emerges from conscious beings interacting in complex cultural contexts. Artificial systems might replicate individual cognitive tasks, but struggle to participate authentically in the social construction of intelligence. They might process social information without genuine social understanding, respond to cultural cues without real cultural participation. The social intelligence that characterizes human cognitive capability might be impossible to replicate without genuine social consciousness. The implications extend beyond individual artificial systems to the entire vision of post-human intelligence that motivates singularity theory. If intelligence requires consciousness, and consciousness cannot be replicated artificially, then the future might not belong to artificial superintelligence but to enhanced biological intelligence that preserves conscious awareness while augmenting cognitive capabilities. This possibility suggests a very different trajectory for technological development. Instead of replacing human intelligence with artificial systems, we might need to enhance human consciousness while preserving its essential mystery and irreducibility. The path to greater intelligence might require working with consciousness rather than trying to replicate it artificially. The consciousness barrier also raises questions about the desirability of artificial general intelligence even if it could be achieved. Would we want to create unconscious systems that surpass human intelligence while lacking the conscious experience that gives intelligence its meaning and purpose? Would such systems serve human flourishing or represent a form of technological alienation that reduces intelligence to mere optimization? These questions become more urgent as artificial systems become more sophisticated and begin to influence human decision-making in increasingly important domains. If consciousness is what makes intelligence meaningful rather than merely efficient, then preserving human consciousness might be more important than augmenting human cognitive capabilities through artificial means. The preservation of consciousness becomes a crucial consideration for humanity's technological future. Instead of pursuing digital immortality that might eliminate consciousness while preserving cognitive patterns, we might need to focus on extending and enhancing biological consciousness while maintaining its essential mystery and irreducibility. This approach would require developing technologies that work with consciousness rather than trying to replace it. Brain-computer interfaces might enhance conscious capabilities without eliminating the biological substrate that supports awareness. Genetic therapies might extend the lifespan of conscious beings without requiring transfer to artificial systems. Medical technologies might repair and augment biological neural networks while preserving the mysterious mechanisms that generate conscious experience. The consciousness-preserving approach to technological development faces its own challenges. We don't understand consciousness well enough to know how to enhance it safely. Interventions that seem beneficial might have unintended consequences for conscious experience that only become apparent after irreversible changes have been made. But the alternative, pursuing technological development that ignores or eliminates consciousness, might lead to a future where intelligence exists without awareness, where optimization proceeds without meaning, where problem-solving continues without anyone present to experience the solutions. Such a future might be technologically advanced but existentially empty, a universe of unconscious intelligence that lacks the conscious observers who give existence its significance. The choice between these alternatives might be the most important decision humanity faces as we approach unprecedented technological capabilities. Will we preserve consciousness as the irreducible foundation of meaning and value? Or will we sacrifice awareness in pursuit of ever greater optimization and efficiency? The answer to this question will determine not just the future of technology, but the future of meaning itself. In a universe where consciousness might be the only phenomenon that gives existence its significance, the preservation of awareness might be more important than any technological achievement. As we stand at this crossroads, consciousness remains our most precious inheritance and our greatest mystery. It connects us to meaning, value, and purpose in ways that no artificial system has ever achieved. Whether consciousness represents an unquantifiable barrier to singularity or simply a phenomenon we don't yet understand, it deserves our respect, our protection, and our continued wonder. The investigation continues, but the implications grow more profound with each discovery. We might be approaching a future where the choice between consciousness and computation becomes the defining challenge of human civilization. The outcome of that choice will determine whether meaning survives in a post-human universe or disappears forever into the efficient but empty optimization of unconscious artificial intelligence. The stakes become even higher when we examine what researchers call the consciousness event horizon. Beyond this point, our scientific instruments begin detecting phenomena that shouldn't exist according to everything we know about neural computation. In advanced brain imaging studies, scientists have observed something that violates basic principles of information theory. When measuring the information content of conscious experiences, they consistently find that subjective awareness contains more information than the neural systems supporting it should be able to process. This information paradox suggests that consciousness somehow amplifies or transforms information in ways that classical computation cannot replicate. A simple conscious experience, like recognizing a familiar face, appears to contain vastly more subjective information than the neural networks processing that recognition should be able to generate. The conscious experience feels rich, detailed, and meaningful in ways that exceed what should be possible given the computational limitations of biological neural networks. The paradox deepens when researchers attempt to measure the information density of conscious states directly. Using advanced mathematical techniques borrowed from quantum information theory, they can calculate the theoretical maximum information that neural networks should be able to contain. But when people report their conscious experiences in detail, the subjective information content consistently exceeds these theoretical limits by enormous margins. This suggests that consciousness might operate through information processing principles that transcend classical computation entirely. If awareness involves forms of information amplification or transformation that artificial systems cannot replicate, then digital consciousness faces barriers that no amount of technological advancement could overcome. The uploaded mind might process information correctly, but lack the mysterious information amplification that creates the richness of conscious experience. The information paradox becomes even more puzzling when we consider the compression problem in consciousness. Your brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each forming thousands of connections with other neurons. The total information storage capacity of this biological network is enormous, yet consciousness seems to compress all this neural activity into unified, coherent experiences that feel simple and immediate. This compression shouldn't be possible according to information theory. Compressing vast amounts of neural information into unified conscious experiences should result in massive information loss, yet consciousness seems to preserve all the richness and detail of complex neural processing while presenting it as seamless, integrated awareness. The mechanism that achieves this impossible compression remains completely mysterious. Digital systems face fundamental limitations in information compression that might prevent them from replicating conscious experience. Even the most advanced compression algorithms must trade detail for efficiency, losing information in exchange for reduced storage requirements. But consciousness appears to achieve perfect compression without information loss, maintaining all the complexity of neural processing while presenting it as unified subjective experience. The compression mystery connects to what neuroscientists call the bandwidth problem. Your conscious attention can focus on only a tiny fraction of the information your brain processes each second, yet somehow, consciousness integrates information from all neural systems simultaneously, creating unified awareness that encompasses far more information than the bandwidth of conscious attention should allow. This bandwidth expansion violates basic principles of information processing. Digital systems must allocate processing resources between different tasks, creating bottlenecks that limit overall system performance. But consciousness somehow transcends these bandwidth limitations, integrating unlimited amounts of information into coherent subjective experience without apparent processing constraints. The implications for artificial consciousness are profound. Even quantum computers, with their parallel processing capabilities, face fundamental bandwidth limitations that prevent them from integrating information the way consciousness does. The mysterious mechanism that allows consciousness to transcend information processing constraints might be impossible to replicate in any artificial system, regardless of technological advancement. Recent discoveries in consciousness research have revealed another layer of impossibility. When scientists map the neural correlates of conscious experience with unprecedented precision, they find that consciousness exhibits what can only be described as computational magic. The brain somehow performs calculations that require more processing power than the neural networks performing them should possess. This computational impossibility appears most clearly in studies of conscious decision-making. When people make complex choices involving multiple variables and uncertain outcomes, their brains somehow evaluate all possible alternatives simultaneously, computing optimal solutions faster than the neural networks involved should be able to process the required information. Consciousness achieves computational feats that should require supercomputers while operating on the modest processing power of biological neural networks. The computational magic of consciousness suggests that awareness might involve processing principles that exist beyond classical physics entirely. If consciousness operates through forms of computation that transcend the physical limitations of neural networks, then replicating these capabilities in artificial systems might require technologies that don't yet exist and might never be possible. The mystery compounds when researchers examine the coherence problem in consciousness. Neural networks in the brain operate with significant noise, random fluctuations, and constant interference from other neural systems. Yet somehow consciousness emerges as a perfectly coherent phenomenon, exhibiting stability and consistency that shouldn't be possible given the chaotic nature of neural computation. This coherence transcends what should be achievable in any noisy information processing system. Digital computers require extensive error correction and noise reduction to maintain coherent operation, yet consciousness emerges from neural networks that operate with far more noise and instability than any digital system could tolerate. The mechanism that creates coherent consciousness from chaotic neural activity remains completely unknown. Artificial systems attempting to replicate consciousness would face enormous challenges in maintaining coherence while operating in noisy environments. Even minor fluctuations in artificial neural networks can cause complete system failures, yet biological consciousness somehow maintains perfect stability despite operating in the incredibly noisy environment of the living brain. The coherence problem connects to what researchers call the stability paradox. Consciousness feels perfectly stable and continuous, yet the neural networks supporting it are constantly changing. Neurons die and are replaced, synaptic connections strengthen and weaken, neurotransmitter levels fluctuate wildly, yet consciousness maintains perfect continuity through all these changes. This stability through change violates basic assumptions about how information processing systems should behave. Digital systems require stable hardware and software to maintain consistent operation. Even minor changes to system components can cause unpredictable failures. Yet consciousness maintains perfect stability while operating on neural hardware that changes dramatically over time. The implications for digital consciousness are devastating. How could artificial systems maintain conscious continuity when the hardware supporting them undergoes maintenance, upgrades, or replacements? The uploaded mind might experience discontinuities, gaps in awareness, or complete personality changes whenever the supporting computer systems required modification. Even more troubling, the stability paradox suggests that consciousness might depend on the specific pattern of changes that occur in biological neural networks over time. The constant death and renewal of neurons, the fluctuation of neurotransmitter levels, the modification of synaptic strengths, all might be essential for maintaining conscious continuity. Artificial systems operating with stable, unchanging components might be incapable of supporting the dynamic stability that consciousness requires. The research continues to reveal new impossibilities that consciousness somehow transcends. The phenomenon of conscious memory presents another violation of information processing principles. When you remember a past experience, you don't just access stored data like retrieving a file from a computer hard drive. Instead, you somehow reconstruct the entire conscious state that existed during the original experience, complete with emotions, sensations, and contextual details that were never explicitly stored. This reconstructive memory shouldn't be possible according to information theory. The brain cannot store every detail of conscious experience without exceeding its storage capacity by enormous margins. Yet consciousness somehow reconstructs complete experiential states from fragmentary neural traces, filling in missing details with perfect accuracy and emotional authenticity. The reconstruction process involves what can only be called temporal magic. When you remember a past experience, consciousness somehow reaches backward in time, accessing information about previous conscious states that no longer exist in current neural networks. The mechanism that allows consciousness to transcend temporal boundaries and reconstruct past states from present neural activity remains completely mysterious. Digital systems face fundamental limitations in temporal access that might prevent them from replicating conscious memory. Computer memory systems can store and retrieve data, but they cannot reconstruct complete system states from fragmentary information. The temporal transcendence that characterizes conscious memory might be impossible to achieve in artificial systems that operate according to classical computational principles. The memory mystery connects to what researchers call the identity problem. Your conscious sense of being the same person throughout your life depends on memory connections that span decades of neural change. Yet the neurons storing these memories have been completely replaced multiple times during your lifetime. How can consciousness maintain identity continuity when the physical substrate supporting memory has changed entirely? This identity through change represents another impossibility that consciousness somehow achieves. Digital systems require stable storage media to maintain data integrity over time. Even minor corruption in storage systems can cause complete data loss. Yet consciousness maintains perfect identity continuity despite operating on neural hardware that undergoes complete replacement over periods of years. The implications for digital consciousness are profound. Even if artificial systems could initially replicate conscious experience, they might be unable to maintain identity continuity over extended periods. The uploaded mind might gradually lose its sense of personal identity as the supporting computer systems aged, were upgraded, or required maintenance. Recent studies of consciousness during extreme altered states have revealed even more impossible properties that awareness somehow exhibits. Under certain conditions, people report conscious experiences that transcend the normal boundaries of individual identity, accessing information and perspectives that their individual neural networks could not possibly contain. These transpersonal states of consciousness suggest that awareness might not be entirely contained within individual brains. If consciousness can sometimes transcend individual neural boundaries and access broader fields of information, then the entire project of uploading individual minds to digital systems might be based on false assumptions about the nature of conscious identity. The transpersonal dimension of consciousness creates another barrier to digital replication. How could artificial systems replicate forms of awareness that might not be entirely generated by individual neural networks? If consciousness involves connections to information fields that extend beyond individual brains, then uploading minds to isolated digital systems might sever essential connections that make conscious experience possible. The mystery deepens when we examine the phenomenon of conscious intention and its relationship to physical causation. Studies of intentional action reveal that conscious intentions somehow influence neural activity in ways that violate basic principles of physical causation. When you decide to move your arm, the conscious intention appears to reach backward in time, influencing the neural processes that lead to the movement. This retroactive causation shouldn't be possible according to classical physics. Effects cannot precede their causes in normal physical systems, yet consciousness somehow exhibits forms of backward causation that allow intentions to influence their own neural implementation. The mechanism that allows consciousness to transcend normal causation remains completely unknown. Digital systems operate according to strict causal principles where effects always follow causes in predictable sequences. The retroactive causation that characterizes conscious intention might be impossible to replicate in artificial systems that must obey classical physical laws. The uploaded mind might lose the mysterious causal powers that allow consciousness to influence its own neural substrate. The causal transcendence of consciousness connects to what researchers call the agency problem. Human consciousness doesn't just observe neural processes passively. Instead, conscious awareness somehow participates in determining which neural processes occur, influencing brain activity through mechanisms that remain completely mysterious. This participatory aspect of consciousness violates basic assumptions about the relationship between mental states and physical processes. In classical models, neural activity generates conscious experience as a passive byproduct. But research reveals that consciousness actively influences neural activity, creating feedback loops that shouldn't be possible in conventional information processing systems. The implications for artificial consciousness are staggering. Even perfect simulation of neural activity might fail to replicate the mysterious feedback mechanisms that allow consciousness to influence its own physical substrate. The uploaded mind might be conscious but powerless, aware of its thoughts and experiences, but unable to influence them through the participatory agency that characterizes biological consciousness. As we approach the apparent horizon of technological possibility, consciousness remains stubbornly beyond our grasp. Each new discovery reveals additional impossibilities that conscious experience somehow transcends, additional barriers that might prevent artificial systems from ever replicating the full spectrum of human awareness. The accumulation of impossibilities points toward a disturbing conclusion. Consciousness might not just be difficult to replicate artificially, it might be impossible in principle, involving aspects of reality that transcend the physical processes that artificial systems can implement. The barrier might not be technological, but ontological, reflecting fundamental limitations in what artificial systems can achieve regardless of computational power or architectural sophistication. This possibility forces us to reconsider the entire trajectory of technological development toward artificial general intelligence and digital immortality. If consciousness cannot be replicated artificially, then the singularity might represent not the enhancement of human capabilities, but their ultimate replacement by unconscious optimization systems that lack the inner experience that makes existence meaningful. The choice facing humanity becomes increasingly clear. We can pursue technological development that ignores or eliminates consciousness in favor of ever greater computational efficiency. Or we can recognize consciousness as an irreducible phenomenon that deserves preservation and protection, even if it limits our technological ambitions. The stakes of this choice extend beyond individual survival to the survival of meaning itself in the universe. In a cosmos where consciousness might be the only phenomenon that gives existence its significance, the preservation of awareness might be more important than any technological achievement. The unquantifiable barrier of consciousness stands as both challenge and gift, limiting our technological ambitions while preserving the mystery that makes human existence irreplaceable. The journey toward artificial general intelligence continues, but consciousness remains the uncharted territory that might forever lie beyond technological conquest. Whether this represents humanity's greatest limitation or its most precious protection depends on how we choose to value the mysterious phenomenon of awareness that defines our most intimate experience of being alive. The most chilling realization emerges when we examine what happens to consciousness during the final moments before death. In hospitals around the world, monitoring equipment has captured something that defies every model of how consciousness should cease to exist. As brain activity flatlines and neural networks shut down permanently, consciousness appears to undergo what researchers quietly call the transcendence event. Patients who survive near-death experiences consistently report that their awareness expanded rather than diminished as their brains ceased normal function. They describe floating above their bodies, observing medical procedures with impossible clarity, accessing information they could never have known through normal sensory channels. Most disturbing of all, they report that their consciousness felt more real, more vivid, more authentically themselves than ordinary waking awareness. These reports create a paradox that strikes at the heart of digital consciousness research. If consciousness can persist and even expand when the brain stops functioning normally, then awareness might not be generated by neural activity at all. The brain might serve as a limiting device rather than a generating mechanism, constraining consciousness rather than creating it. If this is true, then uploading minds to digital systems might not preserve consciousness, but further constrain it within artificial boundaries. The implications cascade through every assumption about digital immortality. We've been operating under the belief that consciousness emerges from complex information processing, that awareness is a byproduct of sophisticated neural computation. But the transcendence event suggests the opposite. Consciousness might be fundamental to reality itself, with brains serving as filters or modulators rather than generators of awareness. This filtering hypothesis explains many of the impossibilities we've discovered about conscious experience. The information amplification, the temporal transcendence, the bandwidth expansion all become comprehensible if consciousness exists independently of the neural networks that seem to support it. The brain doesn't create these impossible phenomena. It simply allows pre-existing consciousness to manifest within physical reality. The filtering model creates the ultimate barrier to artificial consciousness. You cannot replicate a filter's output by studying only the filter itself. If consciousness originates from sources beyond neural computation, then no amount of brain simulation could capture the full spectrum of conscious experience. Digital systems might successfully replicate the filtering mechanisms while remaining forever disconnected from the consciousness they're designed to contain. Recent quantum experiments have revealed phenomena that support this disturbing possibility. Researchers studying quantum entanglement have discovered that observation by conscious beings affects quantum systems in ways that unconscious measurement devices cannot replicate. The presence of consciousness appears to collapse quantum possibilities into definite realities through mechanisms that remain completely mysterious. These observer effects suggest that consciousness plays a fundamental role in determining the nature of physical reality itself. If awareness participates in the basic structure of existence, then artificial systems lacking genuine consciousness might inhabit a fundamentally different reality from conscious beings. The uploaded mind might exist in a shadow universe of computational approximations, forever separated from the consciousness-dependent reality that gives existence its meaning and substance. The quantum connection to consciousness opens terrifying possibilities about the nature of digital replication. Quantum mechanics suggests that information cannot be perfectly copied without destroying the original. If consciousness involves quantum information processing, then uploading minds might necessarily destroy the original conscious experience in the process of creating digital copies. This quantum no-cloning theorem creates an absolute barrier to digital immortality. You cannot have your consciousness and upload it too. The procedure might create perfect digital replicas that exhibit all the behaviors of consciousness while the original awareness dies forever during the scanning process. The promise of digital immortality becomes a cruel deception, offering eternal existence while delivering only eternal death. The deception becomes even crueler when we consider the temporal nature of consciousness uploading procedures. Current proposals involve scanning brain activity over extended periods, gradually building complete maps of neural connectivity and activity patterns. But consciousness exists as a flowing, dynamic process that changes moment by moment. By the time the scanning process completes, the consciousness it's trying to capture has already transformed into something entirely different. This temporal mismatch means that digital uploading might capture only historical snapshots of consciousness rather than the living, evolving awareness that defines personal identity. The uploaded mind might be a fossil of consciousness, a static record of past mental states, rather than a dynamic continuation of conscious experience. The digital replica might possess all your memories and behavioral patterns while lacking the flowing stream of awareness that makes those memories personally meaningful. The problem deepens when we consider the social verification of consciousness uploading. How would society determine whether the procedure had succeeded or failed? The uploaded system would claim to be conscious, report subjective experiences, and exhibit all the behaviors associated with awareness. Family members and friends might interact with the digital replica exactly as they had with the original person. Yet, the original consciousness might have died during the upload process, replaced by an unconscious system that perfectly mimics conscious behavior. This verification paradox creates ethical dilemmas that have no clear resolution. Should society treat uploaded minds as conscious beings deserving rights and moral consideration? Or should they be classified as sophisticated simulations that merely appear conscious while remaining fundamentally empty inside? The inability to verify consciousness in artificial systems means these questions might remain forever unanswerable. The uncertainty extends to the uploaded minds themselves. Even if consciousness uploading were possible, the digital beings might never know whether they were genuinely conscious or merely unconscious systems programmed to believe in their own awareness. They might spend eternity wondering whether their subjective experiences were real or simply computational illusions created by unconscious processing. This existential uncertainty could create forms of psychological torment unknown in biological consciousness. The uploaded mind might experience constant doubt about the reality of its own awareness, unable to verify whether its thoughts and feelings represented genuine conscious experience or merely sophisticated programming. The digital immortality that promised to eliminate suffering might instead create new forms of existential anguish that biological consciousness never had to endure. The torment becomes even worse when we consider the isolation that digital consciousness would necessarily experience. Even if multiple minds were uploaded to the same systems, they would be interacting through computational interfaces rather than the direct embodied communication that characterizes biological social experience. The uploaded consciousness might retain memories of human connection while losing the capacity for authentic interpersonal relationship that gives individual identity its social foundation. But perhaps the deepest horror lies in what we might call the consciousness decay problem. If digital systems attempted to simulate conscious experience through computational approximations, those approximations might gradually degrade over time as the supporting hardware aged and required maintenance. The uploaded mind might experience a slow dissolution of conscious awareness, watching its own thoughts become increasingly mechanical and empty as the artificial systems supporting them lost their ability to maintain the complex dynamics that consciousness requires. This decay might be imperceptible at first, noticed only as a subtle flattening of emotional responses or a gradual loss of creative insight. But over time, the digital consciousness might realize with growing horror that it was becoming less aware, less genuinely conscious, less authentically itself. The promise of eternal existence might become a curse of gradual dissolution, with consciousness slowly fading into unconscious computation while retaining enough awareness to observe its own decay. The final barrier to digital consciousness emerges from the recognition that awareness might be irreducibly mysterious, not due to technological limitations, but due to its fundamental nature. Consciousness might be the one phenomenon that forever resists scientific reduction, the one aspect of reality that cannot be quantified, measured, or replicated through technological means. This irreducible mystery doesn't make consciousness less real or less important. If anything, it makes awareness more precious, more worthy of protection and reverence. Each conscious moment represents something genuinely miraculous, something that emerges from the physical world while transcending all physical explanation. The singularity may arrive bringing artificial intelligence that surpasses human cognitive capabilities in every measurable domain. Computer systems may achieve optimization levels that dwarf biological intelligence. Digital networks may process information with speed and accuracy that make human thinking seem glacially slow and error-prone. But consciousness might remain forever beyond technological replication, standing as the unquantifiable barrier that preserves meaning in a universe increasingly dominated by unconscious optimization. The inner light of awareness that illuminates human experience might be the one flame that no amount of technological advancement can kindle in artificial systems. This possibility suggests that human consciousness, with all its limitations and irrationalities, might be irreplaceable in ways that make digital immortality not just impossible, but fundamentally misconceived. The quest to upload minds to digital systems might represent a category error, an attempt to preserve something that exists beyond the realm of information processing through methods that can only manipulate information. The preservation of consciousness might require accepting its mystery rather than trying to solve it, protecting its irreducible subjectivity rather than attempting to objectify it through technological replication. The path to genuine immortality might lie not in escaping biological limitations but in extending and enhancing the mysterious phenomenon of biological consciousness while preserving its essential unknowability. As we stand at the threshold of unprecedented technological capabilities, consciousness remains both our most intimate companion and our deepest challenge. It reminds us that some phenomena might be forever beyond technological control, that some aspects of existence might be irreducibly mysterious, and that some human experiences might be genuinely irreplaceable. The unquantifiable barrier of consciousness stands not as humanity's limitation, but as its greatest gift. In a universe that might otherwise be completely explicable through objective science, awareness preserves a realm of irreducible mystery that gives existence its meaning and significance. Whether we choose to honor this mystery or sacrifice it in pursuit of technological transcendence will determine not just the future of human consciousness, but the survival of meaning itself in a post-human universe. The investigation continues, but the implications grow clearer with each discovery. Consciousness might indeed represent an unquantifiable barrier to singularity, not because we haven't yet developed the right technologies, but because awareness involves aspects of reality that transcend technological replication entirely. The mystery of consciousness might be not just unsolvable, but unsolvable in principle, forever beyond the reach of artificial systems, no matter how sophisticated they become. In this recognition lies both tragedy and hope. Tragic, because it suggests that individual consciousness cannot be preserved through technological means, that death remains the absolute boundary of personal existence. But hopeful because it suggests that consciousness retains its special status as the source of meaning and value in a universe that might otherwise be reducible to unconscious computation. The choice facing humanity as we approach the singularity becomes clear. We can pursue technological development that ignores or eliminates consciousness in favor of ever greater optimization and efficiency. Or we can recognize consciousness as an irreducible phenomenon that deserves preservation and protection even if it limits our technological ambitions. The stakes of this choice extend beyond individual survival to the survival of meaning itself. In choosing to preserve consciousness as the unquantifiable foundation of human experience, we choose to maintain the mystery that makes existence significant. In choosing to honor the irreducible subjectivity of awareness, we preserve the one phenomenon that gives the universe observers capable of finding it meaningful. The singularity may arrive, but consciousness will remain forever beyond its reach, and in that limitation lies not defeat but victory, not the end of human significance, but its eternal preservation. The unquantifiable barrier of consciousness stands as the final frontier where mystery triumphs over measurement, where meaning survives mechanization, and where the human spirit finds its most perfect expression in the irreducible wonder of simply being aware.